Hey, wealth builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to episode 19 of Bitcoin Hard Talk, where we discuss hard talk about hard money. And today we're going to be talking about a lot of soft money, a lot of hard money, and a lot of new money. We're going to be discussing de-dollarization. We're going to be discussing the latest in this week in Bitcoin, and we're going to be discussing BRICS. We're going to be discussing all of those today and how that ties in to the proof of work network, the proof of weapons network, and the proof of stake network. So we're going to break this into two. The first half, as always, we're going to be covering all the latest that's happened in this week in Bitcoin. And then we're going to go to the second half, which is more educational, where we go through the latest in the proof of weapons network that's leading to the emergence of BRICS, de-dollarization, and some of the geopolitical trends, and obviously how that relates to Bitcoin as our exit. Thankfully, we have the proof of work network, which is the world's largest supercomputer in the world, created by a white paper in 2008 by Satoshi Nakamoto. And thanks to that, we are all protected and we can exit the proof of weapons network and we can give ourselves the ability to have the freedom to transact, the freedom to own our money, and the freedom from inflation and money printing, and the mercy of those that decide the fate of destroying all fiat currencies. We're going to be going through the history of fiat currencies, what to expect, what de-dollarization looks like, so that we can just look back in history and understand what might be happening today. So let's now jump straight right in with this week in Bitcoin. So firstly, stablecoins, Tether, the largest stablecoin in the world, they issued their 2023 profits. And this model of issuing a digital dollar that anyone can send around the world on a blockchain as easy as sending Bitcoin, but have the ability to go from exchange to exchange, and be able to access dollars through a blockchain rather than a bank, a blockchain rather than Swift, a blockchain rather than these proof of weapons network that are filled with all this censorship. You can send it around the world, create an immutable record, and it's backed by what's called cash and cash equivalents. And so that means the way it's meant to work is for every dollar you have with Tether, there was originally dollars at a bank. Now, throughout history, people have questioned that. Things have changed and they now have attestations. But the vast majority of the funds, they now publish all of the assets that back it. And the vast majority are loans to the US government. So this is a big problem for the banking system because this is government straight to blockchain asset with no bank in the middle. And so now there's about $100 billion worth of government loans that are backing these stable coins. Now, Tether has a really interesting business model. For those of you that don't know, I'm a shareholder in Bitfinex. Bitfinex has the same management team as Tether, for full disclosure. And I'm also a shareholder in Circle, who issues the second largest USDC stablecoin that's about to go public. And we covered more on that last week. But Tether announced Q4 2023 profits of $2.85 billion. That's approaching medium-sized banks. And in bad years or some other years, that's the size of major investment banks and financial institutions. $2.85 billion of profit. And the way that is generated is it all comes from the debt of the proof of weapons network, where the US government is having to pay higher and higher interest rates in order to attract people to buy its bonds. And this is leading to higher and higher interest rates that then Tether can use with their excess profits from those coupons to buy Bitcoin or invest in other types of assets. And so the US government's debt is subsidizing the acquisition of Bitcoin backed by a stable coin that people are using and giving their dollars because they'd rather send it around the blockchain rather than have it stuck in the banking system. And they're giving that money where they're giving up the coupon that they could have earned on that, and Tether's earning it so that they can buy Bitcoin in one of the most interesting signs of how inefficient the banking system actually is and how full reserve banking can actually lead to significantly better results than the Ponzi scheme of the fractional reserve banking system. Welcome to the future. That is what we are seeing right now. So it's backed by US treasuries where the coupons get to buy Bitcoin and gold and hedge itself from the risk of the US government because the individuals that want those tethers are happy to take the risk that is backed by treasuries. What a fascinating world. What a transition. Who would have thought that? I remember when Tether first launched and everyone was trying to get exchanges to support it, and everyone thought it was a crazy idea. For the whole of 2023, they had $4.5 billion in excess reserves. Now, all of the critics, and as many critics of Tether because it's been through one heck of a journey over the years, it now covers their approximate $5.8 billion of unsecured loans because it publishes exactly what it's backed by. And so now those that were saying those unsecured loans could blow up, and others were talking about how it had Chinese commercial loans at one point. Now those are all published, and there's mainly US treasuries. But it's still working because the US government is having to pay higher interest rates in order to encourage people to lend to it when people are concerned about its credit rating based upon the fact that it is taking out still the largest output, but also the largest debt in the world as well. And so at the same time, at Bank to the Future, we had a share buyback from Bitfinex, the sister company of Tether, that bought back all those shareholders that were in at a low of about 30 cents through Bank to the Future up to $1. And that did a share buyback at about $10 as well, still trading on the secondary market at about $12 per share. The whole profits for the entire year were $6.2 billion for 2023, according to the figures that they published. Now, those are unaudited financials. This is attestations. And so take with that what you decide to do with that. But that is a fascinating glimpse into the future of stablecoins and the reason why Facebook and Twitter and everyone else wanted to get into this stuff, and the reason why the European Central Bank and every Fed in the world said, hell no, are we going to let Facebook or Meta or whatever we want to call it, the Libra project or DM that was sold to Silvergate Bank that then shutting down because the FDIC needed to bail it out because of its mortgage-backed securities and treasuries that blew up the banking system in 2023 in the US side. So that's an interesting story. Right. What else happened? Genesis, they have settled with the SEC now. They wanted to claim that their earn program is not a security because they wanted to use that as the defense, the same defense that Maszynski is looking to use to keep himself out of prison, while his co-founder, whose wife was actually part of the Israeli IDF and spread the story that was FUD that led to defunding of all of the Palestinian refugees, by being the head of digital marketing at the IDF, who was previously a part of the $3 billion fraud and Ponzi scheme called Celsius that has left creditors and pensioners out of their life savings. Daniel Leone and Maszynski. Daniel Leone is getting off with it because he's in Israel, and Maszynski is facing up to 115 years in prison for his crimes as a result of that. But they're claiming that earn is not a security, so no one wanted to invest. And he's also saying that all of his lies were pure puffery. Anyway, so Genesis want to use that argument. They had to pay a $21 million civil penalty settlement. And because they went into bankruptcy, they got to dollarize everybody's Bitcoin. For those of you not familiar, I've been sharing this, where companies that were fraudulently engaging in illegal securities and essentially being fake banks without licenses. And the regulators in the US allowed them to become multi-billion-dollar companies while they were engaging in fractional reserve banking, essentially doing what banks do, but in a more without the regulator's permission, without the banking license, and without the FDIC Ponzi scheme backing the insurance of it as well. So essentially, they were doing what banks do, but they were allowed to go bust and they operate outside regulations. And so they were just fraudulently using people's money. They had to settle with that. But what happens is a bunch of people were depositing their Bitcoin at this crypto bank. Remember, not your keys, not your coins. They were paying them yield. And then they were ending up creating Bitcoins that didn't exist in order to meet those obligations. And then when the whole house of cards fell, it shows that even a Bitcoin Ponzi scheme by using centralized banking is the same as a proof of weapons network as well. And so therefore we had the massive crypto crash of 2022. And what they do is they take your Bitcoin, they dollarize it at the bottom of the market. So let's say you had Bitcoin there. If it goes into bankruptcy when Bitcoin was about $18,000, they then emerge out of bankruptcy because Bitcoin has gone up to $42,000, but they keep the dollar claim. The price of Bitcoin goes up. Because the price of Bitcoin goes up, they get to pay you back. That's $18,000, but they benefited from the upsides and the creditor loses the upside. In fact, FTX announced this week that they are shutting down any kind of restructuring, FTX 2.0 or anything like that. And they're going to make everyone 100% USD whole because the price of the crypto, they get to steal from creditors, even though SPF fraudulently took client money, bribed politicians, bribed all sorts of politicians around the world. And guess what? That's the one case that's not going to be tried. They decided to skip that because the politicians don't want to give the money back. It was used to buy properties in Bahamas and all sorts of stuff. And thanks to the magic of hard money used with a terrorist style of system, like a bankruptcy process, you get to dollarize the claim, keep the gains, and then allow them to get out of bankruptcy, even though the creditor is left with significantly less Bitcoin. And then they give the headline, they're 100% whole. Well, yeah, Bitcoin makes a lot of people a lot of things. And so the bankruptcy court benefits from that. And all of the different governments, they're jumping on the bandwagon now. Remember how no one wanted Bitcoin in the early days and they all thought it was a Ponzi scheme, a currency just for drug dealers? Well, now all of a sudden they're looking to seize the Bitcoin from all of those people that they were calling criminals back in the day. So the German government came out and they said, we're going to confiscate $2.1 billion from a decade-old website file sharing site. And they're looking for their $2.1 billion of Bitcoin. Thank you. We'll take that. The UK, they decided to do the same. Everybody's trying to figure out how to pay the interest payments on their proof of weapons, debt-based Ponzi schemes. And now they're coming after Bitcoin. So they seized 1.8 billion from a Chinese fraud as well. And everyone's coming after their Bitcoin that before they really didn't care about. So obviously, hard money is eating away at the debt and the devaluation of people's savings while inflation eats away. And so the government's saying, hey, we can eat away at people's savings because we're deep in debt. We can make our debt worth less. And then we can confiscate hard money like Bitcoin to try and service the military industrial complex and the proof of weapons network that allows those fiat currencies to prevail. At the same time, in the proof of stake network, the ETH ETF was delayed. So this is the Ethereum ETF. This was proposed to be launched now around about May. So there was a delay in that one. Because proof of stake as opposed to proof of work means that whoever owns the coin has a vote, as it were, in the governance. When you wrap it up into a share, the largest financial institutions are all going to want to own the network for the people. And so therefore the ETH ETF will probably change it into a network owned by banks. which is why they're looking at how they can decentralize it because the ETF fundamentally changes not Bitcoin, but fundamentally changes proof of stake networks. At the same time, those that are focusing on privacy, like wallets like Tornado Cash, they're being sued by the government. They raised $350,000 for their legal defense, and it was supported by Edward Snowden. So he was supporting the whole concept of privacy. Considered a war criminal, as it were, not a war criminal. What's the word? I'm looking at espionage, a traitor to the country because he exposed all of the illegal spying that all of these companies and the CIA and the NSA and the US government were doing upon people. And he had to seek refuge in Russia. So in the proof of weapons network, we're starting to see that. The proof of stake network, we're starting to see that. But also on the proof of work network, there was a bit of news this week with two new entrants to becoming Bitcoin mining companies. We had Swan Bitcoin, and Swan Bitcoin has accumulated about 4.5 exahashes of power to power the world's largest distributed supercomputer. And so Swan Bitcoin will be verifying transactions as well as providing their services and contributing to the proof of work network. And also a new one, which is Ionic Digital. Ionic Digital has emerged from the fraud of Celsius, which took approximately a bunch of our Bitcoin as creditors and illegally took a loan against it. They borrowed it from Tether, which is some of those types of loans. When the price of Bitcoin crashed, it was liquidated. But the $1 billion was spent on almost $1 billion of mining equipment. And obviously, because all those bets went wrong, the company lost $3 billion of creditors' money. And today it was announced that there's only about 30% of the crypto left. So they've repackaged all of this mining equipment into getting rid of all the fraud, put together a new team, new company, new structure. And Ionic Digital has got a 60-day comment period with the SEC to list on NASDAQ. Full disclosure, as I was one of the largest creditors that got scammed by Celsius, I've had some really, really good investments, but it's all transparent. All of the data is published once it goes into bankruptcy. That was my worst investment. But now we're going to be shareholders, 100% owned by creditors, and we've been working on a restructuring for the last couple of years, and hopefully we'll be getting out of that at this stage. It's currently being valued at approximately $740 million, funded with about $225 million of cash from creditors that we funded that essentially. It's got about $331 million of non-ASIC assets, and ASICs are the machines that power the proof of work network. And we're going to be verifying transactions on the Bitcoin network, and hopefully we can get that listed on NASDAQ. And we're going to have about 122,000 machines mining in Texas, America. And about 66,500 of those are currently mined and installed. And that would bring us up to about 12.7 exahashes, which would make us one of the second largest mining operations in America at the current time. And so we shall see that. We look forward to seeing that going public. We've got 60-day comment period. It's mined about 500 million worth of Bitcoin since 2021. It's been a crazy bad run company, and there's going to be a new board. Full disclosure, I've agreed to be a board observer to try and help stabilize the company and bring my input. I'm not on the board. I'm just simply an observer. I see myself as trying to represent creditors, my own interest, and others, because I'm going to be a significant shareholder in the company. As we said, high risk. We'll see what happens, but there's two new entrants to the proof of work network that are going to be mining. So now let's move over to the proof of weapons network. Now, something really happened. So obviously, there is a lot of debt in the proof of weapons network in China now, and that's starting to come to roost. And so, if you remember back in the 2008 financial crisis, US had these government subsidized Ponzi schemes that were used in order, then all of those assets ended up on the Federal Reserve balance sheet because they were invested in mortgage-backed securities in order to inflate real estate in order to roll over the debt-based Ponzi scheme, and it led to some of the largest bankruptcies in history. Washington Mutual, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, remember those ones? Well, China copied the same policy. It went all YOLO'd into real estate, and Evergrande is the equivalent of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in China. But something interesting is happening here. Hong Kong, which is so Evergrande. Now, what's really interesting about this is Hong Kong is trying to get it into file for bankruptcy, and it went into liquidation. And they're trying to make the jurisdiction into Hong Kong rather than China so it can have more transparency because that was built upon British common law, whereas China has its own version of law. And the transparency is that they're allowing it to essentially go bust because they tried to restructure it. Now, this is really interesting, and don't think that I'm deluded enough to think that there's not some games there that China's playing. But the fact that they're allowing it to go bust and that the US bailed them out and took all of the debt onto the Federal Reserve, and China's not taking on the debt onto People's Bank, PBOC, the central bank in China, is a bit of a testimony towards my theory that every day China's looking more and more like America, America's looking more and more like China, and they're going to meet in the middle with a central bank digital currency based upon those debt-based Ponzi schemes. And so, I think that they're going to be governed in similar types of things. And then CBDCs obviously needs digital identities, and then suddenly FICO scores, where individuals have carbon credit scores and ESG scores, and a digital ID suddenly looks identical to a social credit system in China, but it's being framed in a different way as they creep it on to the American people through central bank digital currencies. Well, if they allow it to go bust, and maybe this doesn't happen, but that's the signals that they're doing, they may bail out some of the state players there. But that is a very, very interesting sign that China believes in free market capitalism more than the Federal Reserve did and America did during the 2008 financial crisis. And so, obviously, with elections coming up in the US, the rates are being left unchanged. The quantitative tightening program is coming to a reversal, and they're moving more back into lower rates and maybe quantitative easing in order to, now that they seem to have come under control a little bit of that inflation. But there's this bogey in the background calling their involvement in the Middle East that may cause a similar effect as we saw in America with the with the Russia and Ukrainian war, and some of the previous Houthi attacks on Saudi Arabia that led to some of these oil price shocks. So in America this week, they had the FOMC meeting and they held rates at approximately 5.25 to 5.5%. However, it didn't stop US Bank Corp. Remember that one from the 2023 bank, the bank run crisis? Well, that one kind of got away, but it had all the massive amount of exposure because the Fed introduced its new policy, its new tool. Remember, we have tools. And so what they do when the Ponzi scheme comes to a critical moment, like people queuing outside banks to get their money back, then they introduce a new tool. Well, US Bancorp, that wasn't one of the companies that needed to go to an FDIC restructuring during the 2023 US bank run crisis, had about a 40% correction in its shares and led to a shutdown on that day because it kicked in to its kicker where the stock has to be cease trading for that day. That's because it was never ever resolved from the 2023 bank run crisis, other than using the tool. And the tool was BTFP, Bank Term Funding Program. Now, that was a 1 year loan from this time, round about March 2023 to March 2024, where essentially they could be financed at a loss in order to make up for the fact that when people were withdrawing their deposits, they don't have enough money, the money is not there, so they have to sell down those assets. And when the government is in a debt-based Ponzi scheme, they increase their rates to attract people to lend to it. The old debt that they lent to the government starts to trade at a discount. And now, remember, stablecoins is no longer backed by the assets that they have and the stress test. And so the banks needed to sell off all those treasuries and debts to the government at distress, at a discount. And therefore, they needed to borrow the difference from the Fed. And the Fed essentially took it on. But those loans end in March 2024. And so we're about to hit the same cycle that we saw last year in the US bank run crisis. So will they with a new tool? Will they refinance? Will they allow? Will they extend? Eventually, it's going to be a central bank digital currency. But because they've only just released FedNow, their pilot program in the US of a central bank digital currency, while politicians go around the world and say, we'll make it illegal in their political campaigns. Trump saying, I'll make a CBDC illegal. The governor of Florida saying, we'll make CBDCs illegal. Well, guess what? The Fed already launched it. It's called FedNow. Look it up. That's the pilot program for the American central bank digital currency. And so will they roll it over in the future with BTFP in March? Are they ready for their central bank digital currencies? Will they expand the FedNow program into issuing debt-free money or allowing banks to go bust? We shall see. I think it's too early for it. Why? Because we're moving into election year. But it could be politicized as a currency war weapon in order to weaken US by using cyber attacks that are or currency and trade wars. Remember what we talked about, the 6 different types of wars, where China could sell down some of their debt in order to create distress in the market if they don't want to wage a military war. Because remember the game, and we'll go through some of that in the proof of weapons network history today as we cover the BRICS topic as well. But at the moment, it's currently the US banking system is propped up by $650 billion of distress loans that the Fed has lent at a loss at the time of increasing government debt to $34 trillion in order to try and halt the bank runs in 2023, while Bill Ackman was going around saying we need to bail out the entire banking system so that you could socialize the losses, while Silicon Valley comes in and tries to buy up some of those distressed banks using the fact that there is a government guarantee in typical crony capitalism, where you co-opt the government in order to socialize the risk onto the people, while the profits are made by those institutions that are closest to the cheapest money at the central bank, called the Cantillon effect. Obviously, these are the types of things that were happening in 2023. So they chose to kick the can down the road a little bit further. So let's see what happens in March as those debts come to expiry. I think we had a little bit of outage here. Azad, are we all back on and okay now?
Yeah, we're back on. I can see you.
Okay. I notice as soon as I talk about certain topics, we seem to get these little outages. At the same time, we used to get a lot more subscribers. So the algorithm is really doing an attack when we talk about certain topics. We keep getting these outages that we've never had before. The algorithm. So can you help me fight the algorithm a little bit? If you're enjoying this content and you think more people should see it in their algorithm, what I need you to do is after 3, hit the like button on YouTube if you're watching on YouTube. Now, I know a bunch of you are probably watching me on Twitter because it's becoming more of a free speech network, but it's also going through its own censorship at the moment with many of the different controls that are happening there. But if you are on YouTube, can you hit the like button? And do me a favor, I want to get to 100,000 subscribers. I've been stuck ever since talking about more controversial subjects at about 91,000 subscribers. Let's get that to 100,000. And that means YouTube will give you a notification. So hit that subscribe button, hit the bell symbol, hit all. Share this video with other people that you think need to build and protect their wealth and understand what's actually going on. That really helps me in case we get more censored, because I may just end up being just on Twitter in the future. But let's make sure YouTube doesn't do that. So what I wanted to do next is I wanted to help people. What I've noticed is that most people, because these things happen in long cycles of 100 years, if someone hasn't experienced something in their lifetime, they tend to not believe that it's possible until it happens. And so what I do to counter that, and this is a psychological effect we all have as humans, we all have something called a reticular activating system, which is the part of the brain that deletes irrelevant information and only focuses on relevant information. It's the same part of the brain that when you buy a new car or you buy a new shirt, you suddenly see everyone else driving that car. That car was always there before, but you didn't notice it. It's only once you bought it that you started to notice everyone else was driving it. This is the part of the brain that allows us to focus only on the things that we think are important to us and delete all the information that conflicts our belief. And so this is what I'm seeing a lot with these new things that people have never experienced before. So what I wanted to do is go through fiat currencies to help people understand that it would be really, really extreme if the US dollar didn't change as the world reserve currency in the next 10 to 20 years. That is actually an extreme thought. And because no one has experienced it, because we weren't around, when Britain, the GBP, declined as a world reserve currency, or you weren't around when the Dutch guilder declined as a world reserve currency, we can only look at history. And a great website I found was called dollardays.org, and it goes through a study of 775 fiat currencies, all the 775 throughout history. And of those 775 fiat currencies, there is absolutely zero historical precedent for a fiat currency to hold its value. That has never happened throughout history. Only one currency that has held its value is hard money. And hard money of 5,000 years was gold. And now we have, of 15 years, Bitcoin. And so no fiat currency ever has held its value. Why? Because they're all debt-based Ponzi schemes. And so when you have to create more debt in order to create more money, when money is backed by debt, you can only deflate the value because you need to find new sources of debt, and then you deflate the debt and you play the debt game in order to accumulate assets, which creates wealth inequality against those that are paying the highest interest rates on their credit card in order to consume and meet their rent payments. And you get this rich poor divide that eventually ends in polar left, polar right politics, everyone hating each other, revolution, civil wars, and then the next country that wants to create the next proof of weapons network takes advantage of that, tries to come in as you get these extreme left and right divides, and governments play us against each other, and the media perpetuates different narratives to make us think that we're all the good guys fighting the bad guys. And we play along and we have media controlling that. But now we have media that kind of reverses that, where we get to find that actually we're just a bunch of people that are being scammed by all sorts of governments and media to make everyone think that we're the good people and they're the bad people. And it's the proof of weapons networks that create this wealth inequality. Now we have an exit called Bitcoin. So of those currencies, 775 fiat currencies, 20% of them failed through hyperinflation. So 20% of fiat currencies hyperinflate into non-existence. From the powerfulest empires, whether it be the Roman empires, to countries that are going through structural reforms like today, like Venezuela and Argentina. Argentina's deciding to get rid of their central bank. El Salvador went dollarized. And when they dollarized, they put in Bitcoin as legal tender. But 20% of them failed through hyperinflation, particularly those that are on the losing side of wars. Remember Germany after the World Wars, the World War One and World War Two. In that era, they had to assume the debt of the winning allies, and that meant that they had to settle in gold, but they could only settle it by printing their currency. And that led to a hyperinflationary environment where people were warming their fireplaces using cash because it was worth more to them to heat their house than it was in value because prices were moving so fast, as they did in Turkey, as they are in Venezuela, as they are in Argentina, and as they are in Gaza right now, where things and prices are going absolutely through the roof because they're contracting the supply of aid into there. And so they're getting this double effect as well. 21% of fiat currencies were destroyed by war. And so war took out. So we've got hyperinflation and war that took out 41% of every single fiat currency in history. 12% were destroyed by independence. So let's say they became independent, and that was the reason for them destroying about 12% of them. 24% were essentially reformed. So, let's say you had, a currency and then it was restructured into a euro. So they decide to give up their central bank and put themselves at the mercy of the policy of the European Central Bank. Britain did that, but they had a deal where they would keep the British pound, join Europe, and they ended up Brexiting anyway, but they kept the Bank of England because they wanted to have independence over their monetary policy. Now, all of these countries in Europe, they have to give up the independence of their monetary policy. And rather than deciding to inflate their own currencies, the European Central Bank gets to inflate their currencies based upon what is looking more and more like fiscal and monetary unions. So 23% are still circulating. So there's only ever been 23% of all fiat currencies that have survived. But of those 23%, there is, let me look at the stats on the website. They're circulating and they're approaching one of these outcomes. The average life, so they are approaching hyperinflation, or they're approaching that, and they've destroyed approximately 99% of their value already, but they're still hanging around because they got a little bit of utility value left. But they're going through the trends that I'm going to be sharing as we start to cover BRICS. I wanted to give this foundational information. The average life expectancy of a fiat currency, on average, across 774 of them, is only 27 years. That's how long it takes for a central bank on the proof of weapons network to destroy a currency, depending on whether it is the mercy of the International Monetary Fund giving it dollar loans, that it then has to print its own money and it starts to run out of its dollar reserves, like a country like Sri Lanka right now, or Pakistan, which goes into civil unrest as a result. Then you have you have the wealth being destroyed there. But the average is 27 years. The shortest fiat currency in history only lasted 1 month. It took 1 month for a central bank to destroy its fiat currency. The longest one in history was backed by the largest military industrial complex, and that was the Great British Pound, because since 1694, when it essentially lent money to the British government in order to fund its war and got control of the banking system through the Bank of England and got the license to create money to the banks, and this private bank was allowed to issue the Great British Pound. And because it was backed by the largest military industrial complex, which is now depressing since America took that role, it lasted 317 years But the original pound, before central banking depleted it into a complete fiat currency, is it wasn't actually a fiat currency before because it was backed by 12 ounces of silver, which is worth about 0.5% of its original value. So, because it was backed by silver, it survived that long, and we entered into a gold standard. And remember, colonialism was used in order to take Africa's gold, India's gold, China's silver to back that currency, which then changes hands during wars. And those that hold, look at central banks, they're willing to print currency and destroy your wealth, but they still want to back it by gold. They still want to hold the hard asset while they're printing the soft asset. So the most successful fiat currency that has ever existed, the Great British Pound, lost 99.5% of its original value when it was backed by some hard money. And that's exactly where it is with the US right now. So let's take a look at the GBP transitioning to USD so that we can then analyze what's happening with BRICS right now. So you've heard me cover in previous broadcasts, so I won't go to. Make sure you sign up to simondixon.com, and we give you a free membership to and I've got the whole archives of all the different videos, the Great Depression of the 2020s video series that I created. Even give you a free digital copy of my book, Bank to the Future, that was the first published book in the world to include Bitcoin, and talked about transitioning to CBDCs before CBDCs was a world. But the Dutch guilder was a gold-backed currency, and it innovated central banking as we know it and capitalism as we know it today. But it outsourced its shipmaking with the Dutch East India Company to Britain. And because Britain was the cheap labor at the time, it started to learn how to do shipmaking, and it decided to build its own naval fleet. The labor got more expensive, and it started to outsource it to other cheap labor forces. And that's when it started creating its colonial empire through the British East India Company, which was funded as one of the first publicly traded stocks in the world in order to expand its colonial empire, to raid Africa of its gold, to raid India of its gold, and to raid China of its silver, and ended up with Hong Kong and some of the various other things that we were experiencing by creating the largest naval fleet. And then eventually we entered into war because of those frictions. And so because it was inflated away, America came along, and America started to learn from the British innovation. It created the most successful economy of all time based upon its US Constitution. But we entered into World War One, where we had the European war that expanded into a global war. And obviously in World War One, America managed to stay out of it, so its land didn't get bombed, and a lot of the European countries got absolutely destroyed, and everyone had to come and fight in the war. And World War One ended in about 2018, and it ended up with a negotiation, a monetary renegotiation. And this is where the US managed to get a significant chunk of hard money, gold, because it was funding a lot of the wars through the military industrial complex, stayed out of the wars. And in the Treaty of Versailles, the losing allies needed to pay the debts for the reparations of the winning countries. It had to be settled in gold, and a bunch of gold ended up in the coffers of the Bank of England, but more in Fort Knox in America to back the currency. And we had a gold standard at the time. But then we moved in after that negotiation, that started to escalate further into World War II as Germany started to take over more and more of Europe. And it started to expand its colonialism into World War II. Then we had the persecution of the Jewish people in the Nazi regime based upon the Europeans and their actions and how they treated the Jewish people. And when that ended, that culminated in Bretton Woods. And Bretton Woods is where the British economist John Maynard Keynes wanted to create a global world reserve currency called Bancor, but it was rejected in favor of Hoover's initiative to create all of that gold ending up in Fort Knox. The dollar could be convertible into a set amount of gold. They could leverage it up in order to create the Industrial Revolution that funded an extremely productive economy because it was backed by gold and anyone could exchange those notes for gold. But all the other currencies were convertible into the US dollar. And so the International Monetary was created in order to create a way of converting those currencies into dollars that was then backed by gold at Fort Knox. And so we had this monetary renegotiation, and that became the prevailing empire. Now, the World Bank then got the world addicted to dollars. And then as it got more and more addicted to dollars, people started to destroy their currencies in order to pay off those dollar loans. The money would end up back in America because those loans were tied to spending them back. And then America would fund and expand the military industrial complex and negotiate foreign policy in all of the countries that would take those IMF loans. Now, eventually, those gold reserves started to deplete. And in 1971, in order to replete them, the Nixon shock happened, where President Nixon took it off the gold reserve and said, and in 33, they actually confiscated all of the people's gold to try and replenish its supply. It was originally, you had to hand it in at about $30, if memory serves me right. Originally $20, then that changed to, I think it was $30. Excuse me if I'm getting the numbers right. Memory is not serving me exactly right. But they confiscated all the gold off of its people. Now it trades at about $2,000 and completely outstripped the money they were printing, because in 1971, the Nixon shock happened and they took the dollar off the gold standard. Now is the anniversary that 1971 was US dollar as a fiat currency. So we're over 50 years into the US dollar fiat currency experiment. The average lifeline is 27 years. And remember, when Britain became a fiat currency, it didn't take long before it got destroyed, even though it was the longest standing one when it was backed by a fixed amount of silver. Right. So that brings us to where we are almost now into our modern era. So let's take some lies at new events that led to the creation of the BRICS initiative. And so look at the currency now. The US dollar has lost 99% of its value since it was created. And we had the global financial crisis where everyone was rolling over debt-based Ponzi schemes in order to get people that couldn't afford real estate to buy real estate. You had subprime loans, and then everyone was pooling together their pensions, and those pensions were investing in real estate. And then Blythe Masters came along and created the credit default swap to ensure the mortgage-backed security. And then the mortgage-backed securities were sliced and diced. And then BlackRock launched Aladdin, the artificial intelligence technology that guided the Federal Reserve in order to tell it which banks could go bust and which ones should be repossessed. Lehman Brothers blows up. Bear Stearns blows up. JP Morgan comes in just like it did in the 1907, where it could borrow the money from the Federal Reserve in order to buy out the distressed banks, and crony capitalism picks its side and it moves further and further away from capitalism when the Fed takes on all of those assets. And it stopped and it bailed out rather than allowing. So as a counterforce to that, Satoshi Nakamoto created the 2008 white paper, and we ended up with the proof of work network, allowing people to exit the proof of work network that was going through a global financial crisis. 10 years later, after showing that it went through every cycle, we start to get issues from nuclear building and nuclear programs as a result of the nuclear race that was happening between Germany and America during World War II. So Germany was trying to build its nukes. America was trying to build its nukes faster. America got there first, and then America obviously backed the proof of weapons network by the fact that they blew up 200,000 Japanese people in Hiroshima, creating the most catastrophic humanitarian crisis Japan has ever seen, and it's been through a lot of volcanoes. But in 2020, we have these hangover effects where America is obviously trying to control, saying, Israel, you can create nukes, but don't tell anyone. Plans were taken out to Iran. Iran started to build its own nukes. And then we had the whole, wars that the Iraqi war, where they were trying to dismantle Iraq of weapons of mass destruction. That because Israel and Netanyahu had told America that Iran is the biggest threat, and so take out Iraq to create friction between Saudi Arabia and Iran, that were huge oil powers. And around about 2020, a deal was signed with America where they would ease the sanctions, allow them to give inspections of their nuclear, and a nuclear deal was signed. And in 2020, after negotiating that deal under the Obama administration, the Trump administration decides, screw that, cancel the deal. The world doesn't trust these nuclear deals anymore, and raged essentially a trade sanctions currency war on Iran by reneging on that deal and destabilizing the Middle East. It then assassinated Qasem Soleimani, who was, essentially the responsible for creating these different militia groups in the destabilized failed states like Syria and Yemen, very offensive, sorry, Syria and Yemen, as a result of the destabilization in Iraq. Took out Saddam Hussein, and we end up with a much worse regime like ISIS. And so now Iran has to spend its time fighting ISIS, and it has to create its own militia groups in these battles. That then, you have these situations that's escalated to where it is right now. So that was cancelled. And then in 2022, we had the Russian invasion into Ukraine as a result of the NATO expansion into Ukraine on the doorstep. So those old battles come up again. And the whole world prints more and more money from the proof of weapons network in order to fund that NATO against the Cold War, which was meant to have ended. And so then we had in 2022, one of those Iranian militias, they started to have an attack on Saudi Arabia oil plants, which creates this massive oil shock. And that oil shock kicked off the hyperinflationary cycle after COVID, where we entered up into a massive inflationary cycle and exposed the proof of weapons network for its volatility. The Houthis went into, and Saudi Arabia said, we'll kind of normalize here. And everything started to move into more normalization. But because Iran and Saudi Arabia, the gas powers, they had their independence, and then Iraq was kind of separating in the middle. We had this destabilizing force. This led to this conflict. And then you had worse terrorists coming along and destabilizing further to fit their agendas. And Siri starts listening to me as I start talking about these subjects. We enter into rate hikes and an inflationary cycle in the US and a cost of living crisis, and is framed as Putin's war, when the reality is it was excessive money printing from the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, and the European Central Bank in order to massively expand those proof of weapons networks. So 2023, we had the US bank run crisis that I discussed, and we have this multipolar economy getting harder and harder and harder. Trump rages war on China, and we have the trade wars and all the other things. Biden continues that in his administration, and everyone said, made to believe that China's the enemy. Yeah, you may not agree with the way that Iran governs their economy or China governs their economy. I don't agree with it either. I'm an Austrian economist, free market freedom guy. I don't like it, but I don't think we should wage wars on those countries. We should allow them to be, because it causes much, much worse effect, as we have seen from history. And so they then lead to the fact that there's those sanctions, and the US dollar puts the final nail in the coffin after the 1971 shock. It starts to actively delete those that hold their reserves, central banks that hold their reserves in dollar instruments, and just wipes out $350 billion of Russian reserves at the central bank. Unprecedented. The whole world says, holy crap, if that can happen to Russia, and then the Bank of England confiscates all of Venezuela's gold, while they're going through a humanitarian crisis, hyperinflationary cycle, complete coups and all sorts of regimes. They confiscate all their gold. People say, well, you hold gold at the Bank of England, they can just take it. You hold dollars, they can just wipe it out and delete it. China said, we're not quite happy holding that dollar debt anymore, especially because they want to reunify with Taiwan at the strategic moment, like they did. So we end up with this coalition called BRICS expanding. BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And they start to look at the technology behind Bitcoin and create mBridge, the central bank digital currency network out of Hong Kong. And the proof of weapons network starts to build a new alternative network that doesn't want to rely on dollars, because SWIFT has become a weaponization sanctioning tool that means that you can try and destabilize and inflict the IMF loans with SWIFT sanctions, with central bank confiscations around the world. Try and keep your country in peace so everyone thinks it's cool, but destabilize lots of other countries through proof of weapons expansion, colonialism. And so they create their own central bank digital currency network. And so the BRIC members suddenly start expanding, and you have this multipolar world. And so remember some of the big conflicts that are happening right here. Remember that we had Abraham Accords before the October the 7th, which was sidestepping Iran, where Trump negotiated between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and took the side of Saudi Arabia, even though they had their own issues with each other, and started to, make invasions in Yemen against the Iranian militia, and then in Syria create a failed state as US started to expand its military bases there and started to put all of its military bases across the Middle East into all these different jurisdictions, and then allowing ISIS through these failed states to expand the real terrorists. And so Iran has these different militia groups that are kind of doing acts which we don't agree with. America classifies many of them as terrorists. And so terrorism gets weaponized where you allow it and back certain ones. We all know that Israel was one of the original funders of Hamas in order to try and create destabilization against the Palestinian liberation, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation. And America starts to originally was funding, bin Laden, which led to Al Qaeda. And then we had the different effects of that. And then that led to destabilization in Iraq. And then suddenly, by funding these things and allowing them to exist in certain regions by implement bases, you get these things where a population thinks we're the good people, they're the bad people. And the reality is governments are doing awful things, all of them, based upon their proof of weapons network. And so now we have this BRICS alliance. Now, this causes a problem because Abraham Accords was looking to sidestep Iran. But what if Saudi Arabia and Iran join it? So throughout this whole thing, BRICS suddenly becomes a bigger alliance, and they start doing trades in Russian rubles and Chinese yuan, and China and Russia, start to stamp out some of the effects of sanctions. And suddenly you show that Russia, even though it got sanctioned, is a $2.2 trillion economy on $500 billion of debt, while America's a $27 trillion economy on $34 billion in debt. With enemies happening with Russia, Ukraine, enemies happening across the Middle East, and enemies happening with China as well. And so we enter this multipolar world. And so we got this massive announcement after the 2023 bank run crisis of those that are going to be de-dollarizing and joining the BRICS alliance. And so we had lots of Kenya were announcing things. We had all of those. Go back to previous episodes of Bitcoin Hard Talk. But let's have a look at BRICS now. What does it consist of? Well, it's China, that's about a $17.9 trillion economy. It's got India, that's a $3.4 trillion economy. Russia, as I said, a $2.2 trillion economy. Brazil, a $1.9 trillion economy. Now it's got Saudi Arabia, an oil-led economy, a $1.1 trillion economy that newly joined it. UAE joined it, historically an ally of Israel, America, and that remember Netanyahu came up and just put up a map in the United Nations and created this corridor by signing the agreement with Saudi Arabia, UAE, and various other were trying to normalize. And then on the map, it said Palestine was just deleted. Now, obviously, Saudi Arabia believes in the Palestinian cause, so that becomes an issue there. But UAE is the 0.5, $500 billion economy as well. Egypt, about the same, $500 billion. They join as well. And South Africa, $0.41 trillion economy. And Iran, a $0.39 trillion economy as well. So now through that BRICS alliance, and also Ethiopia joins as well, which is a $0.13 trillion economy. So the combined GDP of BRICS now is $28.41 trillion of GDP. So BRICS produces more economic output than America as an alliance. Now, I know that doesn't necessarily mean the same thing because the unification across the European Union still speak different languages. And, these networks, these proof of weapons networks become, can they implode on each other as evil agendas start to lay out amongst each other? But that is now on par with USA. And they want to create a network where they can trade all their oil. They can economically trade with each other. They can do Belt and Road Initiative loans. They can do infrastructure development without dollars. And so they then launch the BRICS Bank. And the BRICS Bank is now issuing its own bonds that's not denominated in dollars, that can settle in local currencies to fund infrastructure so that they can get themselves independence from the International Monetary Fund. And that now, the initial is $28 billion of financing for member infrastructure. And so that's the initial one. Now, remember also, we were experimenting in El Salvador with Bank to the Future. We launched the first ever Bitcoin bond. It was proof of work mining in Iceland, and it was powered by volcano power in Iceland. And it used the ice in order to geothermically cool it with natural cooling into those power plants. And it paid Bitcoin daily dividends backed by Bitcoin. It was the most successful bond in terms of ROI. And it was only our investors at Bank to the Future that got access to that. Well, in 2021, I went over to visit El Salvador and President Bukele. They're looking to launch their Bitcoin-backed bonds. And who's involved in that? Bitfinex and Tether, that have the most successful stablecoin in terms of taking dollar coupons, converting those into Bitcoin, repurposing reinvestments into venture capital, into mining that's powered by volcanoes. And then you have proof of work networks that are peacefully mining by repurposing electricity and making efficiency in the grids. And it's a race to mine the final Bitcoins as we transition over to a proof of work network where all of the fees are shared with miners. And so if we can avoid, so you have the El Salvador Bitcoin bond, if that succeeds, do you think other countries are not going to look and say, there's a strategy, make Bitcoin legal tender, launch a Bitcoin-backed bond, have independence from any power, let BRICS, US, battle it out for world reserve currency? And then we have artificial intelligence and all the other future trends, which I'm not going to go into today. But the important thing right now is that the proof of weapons network is escalating. And so this brings me to the final point. That is the de-dollarization trend. That is the BRICS trend that arrives when we enter into this more multipolar world. And so we have to get used to that. And so what is going to avoid World War III and destabilize that? Because remember, the change in world reserve currency is always destroyed through a war and a monetary renegotiation where the winning side negotiate the new money supply at the expense of the losing side. And so if this tit for tat that we are experiencing right now, that's getting very, very dangerous in the proof of weapons network doesn't stop, we risk having a completely new regime. And I think the next proof of weapons network, whether it's BRICS or whatever it is, I'm not giving a view on what I'd like. I'm just saying the trends by reading cycles and reading history. Unless we want World War III and we want a monetary renegotiation that could end up with a radically different world order based upon these trends, where we're all called to fight. UK is already saying, if you go to war, we need more soldiers. You're going to have to fight people. Is America willing to do that if it comes to their ground, if we don't de-escalate right now? Well, the tit for tat is expanding as we speak. So if you haven't been watching, obviously Iran started to blow a shot at its in the border of Syria and Jordan that took out the death of 3 American soldiers. America's retaliating, and we're going for this tick to tack, and it will just go to a different. And every time it brings in a new country, and then countries like Saudi Arabia say, well, we'd rather align with BRICS rather than the whole Abraham Accords that we were on before. And you force everyone to pick a side. Instead, we need to solve real problems. And so I'll leave it there. And I just want to let you know, I'm going to end with the 3 problems that need to be solved if we don't want to escalate to World War III. And then we can end up in the 6 different types of wars rather than military wars and currency wars being fought as we go through these de-dollarization trends. And obviously, all of us being able to exit through Bitcoin as it becomes a geopolitical tool for freedom at the same as it has been for the last 14 years, ever since the 2008 financial crisis. Well, you need to normalize, from my perspective, between the oil powers. So Iran and Saudi Arabia are the ones that need to normalize. Israel doesn't want Iran and Saudi Arabia to normalize. The only one that can do that, because US has picked a side, is China, and China's part of the BRICS network. So if it can normalize and go against what Israel's asking them to do, which is escalate, and Israel won't be happy, because Israel is more than happy to sidestep Iran and use its military power and bring America into World War III. It would be more than happy to do that. So the stakes are bigger. Is way more than what it originally started. Now, remember, everyone in the Middle East, with the exception of Israel, believes in the Palestinian cause and some other nations that are reliant upon the Israeli military-industrial complex in the Middle East. So the Palestinian cause, the Palestinian state, has to exist. China doesn't want war. Russia doesn't want war. Iran doesn't want war. Saudi Arabia doesn't want war. It's only certain groups that do want to do that. And that is, Israel would be more than happy to bring everyone in order to fund to take America's money in order to achieve its expansive goal. And that is exactly why America has always created this destabilization in the Middle East. And obviously there's been reactions, and I'm not saying anyone is guilty. These are all guilty people. Watch Game of Thrones. These are all evil regimes. Governments are just a way of getting in between our relationship, between our humanity, by creating these fake borders that create people wanting to hate each other. And so you have to have a Palestinian state in order for this to be resolved. America wants it. America's demanding it. And Israel saying, hell no. And yet America's funding the whole thing. And so that needs to be resolved. You need to normalize between Saudi Arabia and Iran. BRICS and China is the only one that can do that. You need to recognize the Palestinian state, because Saudi Arabia, Iran believe in that, even though they're enemies. And then we can start to solve some of these humanitarian crises and these failed states due to colonialism and expansion and US intervention in these regimes, and evil terrorists like ISIS and all those other things that are happening there. And you got to listen to what everyone's asking for right now in this tick for tack, which is saying, America, leave your foreign policy. Focus on America. Take the money back home. Don't bring America into this. Don't fund these foreign policies. Don't blow up, and don't allow these 150 different things that people that want America out of their country are targeting right now, that's leading to US deaths. That's the opposite of what Israel is demanding right now. And the Netanyahu regime is demanding that America gets involved, escalates, because that government regime is more than happy to sacrifice American lives, British life, European lives, and escalate to World War III in order to take out its perceived threat by Iran. And we're being led to believe that there's one good side and one bad side. Now, remember, with BRICS, Saudi Arabia, Iran, China, and Russia are creating those trading corridors. And that's what happens when you allow these rogue governments to scam the world because of many of the evils that have been happening to the Palestinian state that the world wants, with the exception of one country, and scam the world into thinking that everyone needs to stand by it when it could lead to World War III, which is exactly what I was warning about from October the 8th. And people were calling me an anti-Semite, even though half my family's Jewish, because I didn't want to go into World War III. And so even though the US wants it, these are the things that need to be, and these are why I stand by peace. And this is what I believe needs to happen. And that's going to end it there. Remember to protect yourself. So a couple of things that I'd like to share with you. Obviously, will South Africa be able to prove genocide and then that get in effect? Well, there's also the genocide court case that's happening with Russia and Ukraine. And so it was slightly an opposite. It was resolved today that Ukraine lost that side because they were trying to claim that Russia used genocidal intent from Ukraine to justify the war. The impact of that has the impact on the Israel-South Africa genocide case. So will it be one rule for one when you're on the side of America and another rule for the other when you're on the side, not on the side of America? Well, the world gets to see, and that creates a really challenging problem. And so that's been dismissed, and it were ruled in favor of Russia for certain parts and Ukraine for certain parts. So these things matter. Will Saudi Arabia and Iran be able to normalize through BRICS? I think that's an important stabilizing effect, so we can have multipolar, so that the different regimes can regulate each other as we accept de-dollarization as a thing. Or will we choose World War III? There's a lot of people hungry for World War III. And when I listen to Twitter Spaces, I'm going to be doing shortly after this, in about 15 minutes, a debate on Twitter Spaces with some Bitcoiners around why I think these ways. Then people think very differently. But the two people that I'm seeing on Twitter Spaces saying war, expand, get back at Iran, go this, go that, US target, are the people that have got, you know, their regimes that they want to get. So it's people in Iran that don't want to, that want fighting against their regime, that don't necessarily live in Iran anymore. They're more than happy to send American people to blow up those people that live locally because they want to topple their regime. And I'm not saying it's a good regime. And it's also Israel that wants to expand because they want to have no Palestinian state and expand that into Syria, expand that into Yemen, expand that into Jordan, expand that into Egypt, because we need to end and just accept that we are where we are. Bad mistakes have been made, but we all need to figure out how to live in peace rather than escalate to World War III, because I certainly don't want to fight in that war. And I've been sat in front of Bitcoin and computers for the last 10 years, and I'm in no fit state to fight for something that I don't believe in. And so that is the importance of this. De-dollarization and bipolarization and having Bitcoin as an exit creates a friction that allows, just like nuclear weapons, where no one wants to go to war because everyone has a nuclear weapon. It's a detracting an event. We're having one country that is the charge of the largest proof of weapons network is destabilizing by nature, and it makes people believe that they're the good people when their regime is being used to commit evils in other countries, and the media allows you to think that those evils aren't being committed because they control that through the proof of weapons network. So we transition to a CBDC and Bitcoin world. If you want to follow that transition, subscribe to this channel, like this channel. Head over to simondixon.com, where I'll be updating you and sending you all updates on that in my membership site. And I'm going to head over to Twitter right now in approximately 15 minutes. I'm going to be doing a debate with a fellow Bitcoiner that takes the exact opposite view of me, so that we can have that friction on Twitter Spaces and get both sides, because I know that you have heard the Western side. And maybe some of this is a side that you think is a little bit shocking because it's not the side that is told to you. And so I want to deliver that message. And if that, because I actually believe in peace. And so I think these debates and being able to speak to people all around the world as we experience this is a vital part as we transition. So always remember, no matter how bad it gets, you are actually alive in one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. If you're on the wrong side of these trends, you're going to get wrecked. If you're on the right side, you're going to do incredibly well. And I want as many people on the right side of that change. I want to do it with peace. I want to do it with love. And I want to do it with unity, without those governments that scam us into thinking that we all hate each other, and get in the way of those relationships. So I will see you over on Twitter Spaces, X Spaces. Sorry, Elon, X Spaces for the debate. Peace.